Barron Trump faces a heckler. His calm response changes the crowd's perspective. Begins with an unexpected confrontation that shakes a tense charity event. How will Barron's unshakable composure and surprising actions inspire a struggling community and change how they view him? Before we dive into this powerful story of transformation and unity, let us know where you're watching from today in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge perspectives. The low hum of conversation filled the community center as people milled about, clutching paper cups of coffee and flyers for local charity initiatives. A sense of purpose hung in the air, though an undercurrent of curiosity kept the room abuzz. Barron Trump had just arrived, stepping into the spotlight for a charity event organized to support underprivileged youth. The event, hosted in a suburban community center, aimed to bridge divides in an increasingly polarized society. Barron, now in his late teens, had grown accustomed to public appearances but preferred to keep them meaningful. Today wasn't about him, though. He wanted to focus attention on the youth participating in the event, especially Eric Thompson, a black high school senior and a star volunteer whose efforts were pivotal in organizing the day. Eric, a sharp-witted teenager with a relentless drive for equality, had a knack for getting people to listen without raising his voice. Eric Thompson, right? Barron extended a hand, his tall frame towering slightly over the young man. Eric hesitated for a second before grasping Barron's hand in a firm shake. "Yeah, that's me." "Thanks for being here," Eric said, his tone cordial but cautious. He wasn't sure what to make of the tall, pale young man in a crisp button-down shirt. The kids have been looking forward to this. It's not every day someone in your position shows up. Barron nodded, sensing the guarded note in Eric's words, but choosing not to address it directly. "I'm here for the kids and for people like you putting in the real work." The room was set up with booths showcasing community projects, after-school programs, mentorship opportunities, and food banks. At one table, a young girl painted colorful handprints on a canvas to be auctioned later, while at another, a group of teens practiced their speeches for a youth empowerment forum. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the murmur of voices suddenly hushed. A man in his 40s, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, stood near the back of the room, his voice cutting through the air. "Why is he here?" the man shouted, gesturing toward Barron. His tone was loud enough to make heads turn, and the room tensed instantly. What does someone like him know about real struggles? Eric, now standing a few feet away, felt a chill ripple through his body. He looked at Barron, half expecting him to react with indignation or anger, but the young man remained still, his expression calm. "Excuse me," Barron asked, his voice steady but commanding enough to carry across the room. "You heard me," the man snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is just a photo op for you, isn't it? You don't belong here." Eric's jaw clenched. He had seen enough situations like this to know how quickly they could escalate. The heckler wasn't just targeting Barron as a public figure, he was digging into something deeper, something ugly. Around them, whispers broke out as people tried to gauge what would happen next. Barron took a measured step forward, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. "I don't know your name, but you seem upset. Do you want to talk about it?" The crowd exchanged glances. The calmness in Barron's voice wasn't what they had expected, and neither was the lack of defensiveness. Even Eric, who had braced himself for a verbal standoff, was caught off guard. "My name's Joe," the man replied after a beat, though his tone was still hostile. "And yeah, I'm upset. I've lived here my whole life, working my tail off, and I don't see anyone showing up for me or my kids. But you get all the attention just for walking into a room." Eric opened his mouth to respond but stopped when Barron raised a hand, signaling that he had it under control. "Joe," Barron said carefully, "it sounds like you've had a tough time. That's exactly why I'm here, to support families like yours, to listen and to learn. I'm not here to take away your spotlight." Joe's scowl softened slightly, though skepticism still lingered in his eyes. Barron's composure had disarmed him, if only a little. Eric watched silently, a flicker of admiration creeping in despite himself. He had expected the worst, but what he saw in Barron wasn't entitlement or arrogance, it was something closer to empathy. "Why don't you stick around?" Barron continued. "Maybe you'll see this isn't about me at all. It's about us." The room held its breath as Joe hesitated, seemingly caught between leaving in anger or staying to see if Barron's words held any weight. Finally, with a grumble, He crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall, signaling a reluctant truce. Eric couldn't help but shake his head slightly in disbelief. He had a feeling this event was about to get far more interesting. The room regained a semblance of calm as the event carried on, but the tension lingered like a faint echo. Joe, the heckler, had stayed, though his skeptical eyes tracked Barron's every move. Conversations resumed, but they were hushed, almost cautious, as though the room had collectively decided to avoid igniting another confrontation. Eric Thompson, still watching from the sidelines, found his focus split. While he admired Barron's calm demeanor in handling Joe, part of him remained skeptical. People like Barron didn't often face the kinds of challenges that Eric and others in his community encountered daily. That gap in experience made Eric question whether Barron could truly understand what was at stake. Barron, meanwhile, continued to engage with attendees, shaking hands and listening intently to their stories. A group of young volunteers, mostly teens, crowded around him near the art booth. Among them was a girl named Kayla, no older than 14, her hands smudged with paint. "This is for the youth center," Kayla explained, holding up a half-finished painting of a tree with handprints for leaves. "We're raising money to fix the roof and get new books for the library." Barron crouched to meet her eye level, smiling warmly. "This is beautiful, Kayla. I'm sure people will love it." Her face lit up with pride. "You think so?" "I know so," Barron replied. "You've put your heart into it, and that always shines through." Before the moment could settle, Joe's voice rang out again, louder and more confrontational this time. "That's rich. Coming from you," he barked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Telling kids to work hard while you've had everything handed to you." A hush fell over the crowd once more. All eyes turned to Barron, who stood slowly, his expression unchanging. Kayla shrank back, clutching her painting as if it might shield her from the tension in the air. Eric stepped forward, ready to intervene. He felt his chest tighten as he imagined how this could escalate. But Barron gestured subtly, signaling for him to stay back. "Joe," Barron began, his voice steady but firm, "I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here because I believe in these kids and this community." Joe crossed his arms, his stance defiant. "Believing in them doesn't pay their bills or keep them safe at night. You don't know what it's like out here. You've got your bodyguards, your fancy schools, your silver spoon." Eric's fists clenched at his sides. He had spent years speaking out against injustices in his community, but Joe's anger, though understandable, was misplaced. Barron wasn't the enemy. Still, Eric hesitated to step in, unsure if his presence would help or hurt. Barron tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You're right," he admitted. "I haven't lived your life. I haven't walked in your shoes. But that doesn't mean I can't stand with you or learn from you." Joe faltered for a moment, his expression flickering between anger and surprise. He hadn't expected Barron to agree with him, let alone acknowledge his point. "I'm not pretending to have all the answers," Barron continued, "but I believe in listening and working together to find solutions. This isn't about where I come from, it's about where we can all go together." The crowd murmured, their attention fully locked on the exchange. Kayla, still clutching her painting, seemed to draw strength from Barron's calmness, stepping a little closer to his side. "You think words are enough," Joe countered, though his tone had lost some of its bite. "You think speeches and smiles will fix what's broken." "No," Barron replied simply. "Actions speak louder. That's why I'm here to listen, to understand, and to act. But I need people like you to tell me what needs to change." Eric couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. Barron wasn't backing down, but he wasn't meeting Joe's anger with more anger, either. It was a lesson Eric had learned the hard way. Sometimes the strongest response was the calmest one. Joe seemed to struggle with his next words. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shaking his head as if he couldn't decide whether to stay or leave. Finally, he muttered, "We'll see if you mean it," before retreating to a quieter corner of the room. Barron turned back to the group of teens around him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Sorry about that, Kayla. Can I still count on a handprint for that tree?" Kayla nodded, her confidence returning. "Yeah, you can." Eric approached slowly, his skepticism giving way to a cautious respect. "That was impressive," he admitted. Barron turned to him, his smile faint but sincere. "Thanks. I just hope I'm earning the chance to be here." Eric studied him for a moment, then nodded. We'll see, he said, echoing Joe's words but with less hostility. For now, he decided, Barron had earned at least that much. The crowd lingered in a state of hushed uncertainty after Joe's retreat. Conversations resumed in small pockets, but the energy in the room had shifted. The earlier sense of purpose was now mingled with unease, as though everyone waited for another eruption. Even Eric felt it, a tension knotting his shoulders as he leaned against the refreshments table, keeping an eye on Barron. Barron, on the other hand, appeared unshaken. He moved between the booths, stopping to engage with attendees as though nothing had happened. His calmness wasn't feigned, it was deliberate. He had learned early on that composure was its own form of power, and today he was determined to use it. Eric, Barron called, motioning him over. Can you help me with this? He gestured to a table piled high with canned goods and boxes of supplies, donations for a local shelter. Eric hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Sure, he said, keeping his tone neutral. Together they began sorting the items into categories. I'm sorry about Joe, Barron said quietly as they worked. I didn't mean to cause a scene. Eric shrugged, his movements deliberate as he stacked cans of soup. Not your fault. He's angry, and not without reason. This community has been overlooked for a long time. Barron nodded, his brow furrowing. I get that. Or at least I'm trying to. That's part of why I'm here, to understand, not just to be seen. Eric glanced at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Understanding's a good start, he said cautiously. But it's just that, a start. People want to see action. Barron met his gaze. Then maybe you can help me figure out what kind of action makes the most impact. Eric blinked, caught off guard by the openness in Barron's tone. He was used to platitudes from people in Barron's position, vague promises that led nowhere. This felt different, though he wasn't quite ready to trust it yet. Before Eric could respond, a voice broke through the murmur of the crowd. Hey, Barron! Joe had returned, standing near the center of the room. His voice was still loud, but it lacked the venom from before. You talk a big game about listening and learning. How about you prove it? All eyes turned to Barron again. Eric tensed, unsure how this would play out. He was ready to intervene if things escalated, but Barron held up a hand, signaling for calm. What do you have in mind? Joe, Barron asked evenly, stepping toward him. Joe smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Why don't you come out to the corner of Broad and Maine next weekend? That's where the real struggles are. Let's see if you can handle it. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Broad and Maine was notorious a hotspot for poverty, crime, and systemic neglect. It wasn't a place people like Barron were expected to go. Barron didn't hesitate. I'll be there, he said firmly. And I'll bring whatever resources I can to help. The room fell silent. Even Joe looked surprised, as though he hadn't expected Barron to agree so readily. Eric stepped forward, his voice low but clear. You sure about this? Broad and Maine isn't just a photo op. Barron turned to him, his expression steady. I'm sure, he said. If I'm going to understand, I need to see it firsthand. Joe nodded slowly, his smirk fading into something closer to grudging respect. All right then, we'll see if you're for real. The tension in the room eased slightly as Joe stepped back, though the air remained charged with curiosity. Barron turned back to the crowd, addressing them as a whole. This isn't about me, he said, his voice carrying across the room. It's about all of us, working together to make real change. I don't have all the answers, but I'm here to listen, to learn, and to do my part. I hope you'll join me. A smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing stronger as more people joined in. Kayla, still clutching her painting, was the first to cheer, her voice clear and confident. Eric watched the scene unfold, a mixture of skepticism and admiration swirling in his chest. Barron had passed the first test, but the real challenge was yet to come. Broad and Maine wouldn't just test Barron's resolve, it would test his ability to follow through on his words. As the applause faded, Eric stepped closer to Barron, lowering his voice. If you're serious about this, I'll come with you. But if you're just playing a part. I'm not, Barron interrupted, his tone steady. I'm serious. Eric studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll see what you're made of. The following weekend arrived with the same heavy air that often hung over Broad and Maine. The street, lined with shuttered businesses and graffiti-covered walls, told a story of abandonment and struggle. People lingered on corners, some chatting in hushed tones, others simply watching as life passed them by. Among them were mothers shepherding children, workers on their way to odd jobs, and teenagers who had learned to navigate the streets long before they should have had to. Barron Trump stepped out of a modest car, dressed in jeans and a plain jacket, a stark contrast to his usual polished appearance. He carried a few boxes of donated supplies, followed closely by Eric Thompson, who had taken it upon himself to guide Barron through this new terrain. "You sure you're ready for this?" Eric asked, his voice low as they approached a group of volunteers setting up tables. The crowd was already starting to gather, curiosity drawing more people out of their homes. Barron nodded, his expression resolute. "I am. Thanks for coming with me." Eric shrugged, though there was a trace of respect in his eyes. "We'll see how it goes." The tables quickly filled with donations, canned goods, winter coats, books for children. A local pastor welcomed them with a firm handshake and a skeptical glance toward Barron. "Didn't think you'd show," he admitted, his voice tinged with suspicion. "I'm here," Barron said simply. "What can I do to help?" The pastor gestured toward a group of children huddled around a makeshift book stand. "Start there. Show them you care." Barron didn't hesitate. He crouched beside the children, engaging them with questions about their favorite stories and encouraging them to take books they liked. His sincerity began to chip away at the skepticism surrounding him, though the change was subtle and slow. As the morning wore on, Joe appeared, blending into the crowd with an air of reluctant curiosity. He leaned against a lamppost, watching Barron interact with the community. The hostility that had marked his earlier encounters with Barron had softened, replaced by a guarded interest. Nearby, Eric was organizing coats for distribution when he overheard a group of men murmuring. "What's he even doing here?" one asked, his tone doubtful. "This some kind of stunt." Eric, unable to hold his tongue, stepped in. "It's not a stunt," he said firmly. "He's here because he wants to be. Give him a chance." The men exchanged glances, their skepticism still evident, but they didn't argue. Instead, they turned their attention back to Barron, who was now helping an elderly woman carry a box of groceries to her car. "That's a start," one of the men muttered, grudgingly. The turning point came later that afternoon when a young boy, no older than 10, approached Barron hesitantly. His clothes were too small, his sneakers worn thin. "Mister," the boy said softly, holding out a tattered book, "can I keep this? It's got my name in it." Barron took the book, flipping it open to see the name scribbled inside the front cover, Jamal. He smiled and handed it back. "Of course, Jamal, it's yours." The boy's face lit up, and he clutched the book to his chest. "Thanks," he whispered before darting off to show his friends. Joe, who had been watching from a distance, stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You're good with the kids," he said, his tone lacking the usual edge. "They're the future," Barron replied. "They deserve every opportunity we can give them." Joe nodded slowly, a trace of respect creeping into his demeanor. "You meant what you said last week, didn't you?" "I did," Barron said without hesitation. "This isn't about me. It's about what we can do together." The ripple effect of Barron's presence began to show. More people joined the event, bringing donations and offering to help. Conversations grew louder and more animated as neighbors who had once kept to themselves started engaging with one another. The street, so often defined by struggle, felt alive with possibility. Eric, watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in Barron, but in the community. For the first time in a long time, it felt like something was shifting, like hope was starting to take root. As the day wound down, Barron approached Joe, extending a hand. "Thanks for challenging me," he said. "It pushed me to be better." Joe hesitated before shaking Barron's hand, his grip firm. "I'll admit, I didn't think you had it in you," he said. "But maybe I was wrong." Eric stepped forward, joining them. "You were wrong," he said with a faint smirk, "and I think you know it." Joe laughed, a sound that seemed almost foreign in the context of their earlier encounters. All right, you've earned a little credit." Barron smiled, his expression one of quiet determination. "It's a start," he said, "and there's more work to do." As the event came to a close, the community lingered, reluctant to let the moment end. The ripple effect had begun, and though the road ahead would be long, it now seemed just a little more possible. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Broad and Maine, illuminating the faces of those who had gathered. The event was winding down, but the energy in the air remained electric. People lingered, reluctant to let the newfound sense of connection slip away. Conversations buzzed, laughter echoed, and for the first time in a long while, the street felt alive with hope. Barron Trump stood near the bookstand, his sleeves rolled up and his hands smudged with dirt from unloading boxes. Despite his tired appearance, his expression was calm and resolute. Nearby, Eric Thompson handed out the last of the donated winter coats, watching Barron from the corner of his eye. Joe, leaning against a table stacked with canned goods, crossed his arms and surveyed the scene. The skepticism that had once defined his demeanor had softened into something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps respect. He still wasn't fully convinced, but it was clear that Barron's actions had made an impression. The moment of unity came unexpectedly. A young mother, her arms full with bags of groceries, struggled to corral her 2 children, both under the age of 5. One of the children, a boy with wide, curious eyes, dropped his stuffed animal into the street. Before anyone could react, Barron stepped forward, picking up the toy and kneeling to hand it back to the boy. "Here you go," he said, his voice warm. "Thank you," the mother said, balancing her bags while trying to manage the children. "Let me help you with those," Barron offered, taking some of the bags from her arms. The small gesture caught the attention of the crowd. People paused in their conversations, watching as Barron walked the woman to her car, chatting with her children and helping to load the groceries. It was a simple act, but it carried weight. In that moment, Barron wasn't a public figure or a symbol, he was just a young man trying to make a difference. "See that," Eric said quietly, nudging Joe with his elbow. "That's what it's about." Joe grunted but didn't argue. Instead, he watched as Barron returned to the group, smiling faintly as the children waved at him from their car seats. As Barron rejoined the crowd, an older man approached him. The man, his weathered face marked by years of hard work and struggle, extended a hand. "Thank you for coming out here," he said. "Most people in your position wouldn't bother." Barron shook his hand firmly. "It's not about me, it's about what we can do together." The man nodded, his grip lingering for a moment before he turned back to the group he'd been talking with. Slowly, others began approaching Barron, sharing their stories, expressing gratitude, or simply shaking his hand. What had begun as a tense, skeptical gathering was transforming into something else, a community coming together. Joe, unable to resist the pull of the moment, stepped forward. "All right, Trump," he said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "You've got some of us warming up to you, but talk's still cheap. What's next?" Barron didn't hesitate. "This can't end here," he said, addressing the group. "There's so much more we can do. We need to keep the momentum going, regular events, more resources, and a commitment to showing up for each other. I'm here for it, and I hope you are too." The crowd murmured in agreement. A woman in the back raised her hand, calling out, "What about Broad Street Elementary? They've been asking for volunteers to help with the reading program." Another voice added, "And the park. We've been trying to organize a cleanup, but we don't have enough people." Barron nodded, his face lighting up with determination. "Then let's make it happen. I'll be there, and I'll bring whoever I can to help." Eric stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crowd. "Count me in," he said. "And not just because of Barron. This is our community, and we've got to take care of it." His words were met with a chorus of agreement. The energy in the crowd shifted once again, growing stronger, more unified. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans, and committed to taking the next steps together. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the sense of unity deepened. What had started as a simple charity event had become a catalyst for change. Broad and Maine, once defined by its struggles, now felt like a place where hope could take root. Barron stood beside Eric, watching the crowd as they dispersed. "Looks like we've got a lot of work ahead of us," he said, a faint smile playing at his lips. Eric nodded, his own smile breaking through. "Yeah, we do, but for the first time it feels like we've got a real shot at making a difference." The 2 young men, from such different worlds, stood side by side, united by a shared determination to build something better. In that moment, they weren't just individuals, they were part of a community, and together they were unstoppable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber, Broad and Maine began to quiet down. The tables had been packed up, the donated items distributed, and most of the attendees had returned home. What remained was a lingering sense of unity, a warmth that hadn't been felt on this street in years. Barron Trump, Eric Thompson, and Joe stood near the corner, their silhouettes framed by the fading light. Barron stretched his arms and exhaled deeply, looking out at the nearly empty street. "We did something good today," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction but also exhaustion. Eric nodded, leaning against a lamppost. "Yeah, we did. But this is just the beginning. You said it yourself, what matters is what comes next." Joe, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the evening, chimed in. "You surprised me, Trump," he admitted, his tone gruff but lacking its usual edge. "I didn't think you'd stick it out, let alone actually connect with people." Barron glanced at Joe, his expression earnest. "I meant what I said. This isn't just a one-time thing. I want to be part of the solution." Joe raised an eyebrow. "We'll see if you keep that promise. People around here are used to being let down." Eric stepped forward, crossing his arms. "It's up to all of us to make sure we don't let each other down. This isn't about one person, it's about the community." Barron smiled faintly, appreciating Eric's words. "Exactly. And I'm here for the long haul." The three stood in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. The day's events had been transformative, but they also underscored the challenges ahead. Broad and Maine was a microcosm of larger issues: poverty, systemic neglect, and a deep-seated distrust of those in power. Changing that would take more than a single afternoon. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the corner. A young boy, Jamal, approached them, clutching his tattered book. His wide eyes sparkled with gratitude as he looked up at Barron. "Thanks for today," Jamal said quietly. "It was different. Good different." Barron crouched to meet his gaze, his smile gentle. "You're welcome, Jamal. You're the reason we're here, to make sure you and every kid like you have a chance to dream big." Jamal nodded solemnly, then glanced at Eric. "Are you going to come back too?" Eric's heart softened at the boy's question. "Yeah, kid," he said. "I'll be back. You've got my word." Jamal grinned and ran off to join his mother, who waved at the group before disappearing down the street. The sight left a lump in Barron's throat. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of everything he hoped to achieve. Joe broke the silence, his voice softer than usual. "You've got a lot to prove, Trump. But I'll admit, you've got guts. Maybe we'll see what those guts can do." Barron extended a hand, his gesture one of mutual respect. "We'll do it together, Joe. This is your community, too." Joe hesitated, then shook Barron's hand firmly. "All right, don't screw it up." Eric watched the exchange, feeling a flicker of hope. For years, he had fought to bring attention to his community's struggles, often feeling like he was shouting into a void. Today, though, something had shifted. It wasn't just about Barron, it was about the connections being built and the possibilities they represented. As the evening grew colder, Barron and Eric began walking back toward their car. Joe stayed behind, watching them go with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Eric said, breaking the silence, "you could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." Barron shook his head. "I couldn't. Not when there's so much to do." Eric smirked. "Well, you've earned my respect for now." Barron chuckled. "I'll take it. But I know I've got a lot more to earn." When they reached the car, Eric stopped and turned to face Barron. "You've got potential, man. Just remember, it's not about the headlines or the speeches. It's about showing up, every time." "I will," Barron promised. "And I'm glad you're with me on this." Eric nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. As they got into the car and drove away, the streets of Broad and Maine faded into the distance, but the impact of the day lingered. In the quiet hum of the car, Barron stared out the window, already thinking of what the next steps would be. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. Eric, watching him from the passenger seat, allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt like change was not only possible, it was inevitable. Back at Broad and Maine, the streetlights shone down on a place that had begun to heal. The community wasn't fixed overnight, but it had taken a step forward. And that step, small though it may have been, was enough to inspire hope. It wasn't just Barron's presence that made the difference, it was the unity, the willingness to come together and confront the challenges they faced. That unity, born of a single day, had the power to ripple outward, touching lives in ways none of them could yet imagine.